Welcome to the Pure Property Podcast. Whether you are considering buying your first investment property or reaching property mogul status, we dissect the fundamentals through to large-scale property development and everything in between.
It's like a Seinfeld riff, isn't it?
I actually gave that feedback.
The Pure Property Podcast. We made it past the pilot episode. Surprise, surprise. Obviously, something's going right. We only launched this last month. New instalment coming to you live on the Property Investment Podcast Network. I'm Phil Tarrant, co-host of the Pure Property Podcast with Paul Glossop. I'm not Paul Glossop. It's not my mug on the branding there either. The caricature, which has been getting rave reviews from across Australia. The punters love it. I think I like it more than you, Paul. But
Yeah.
you're back.
I am back.
But you're back.
By unpopular demand.
I've been looking at the reviews coming through on.
Thank you for everyone.
Yeah,
who
I've seen
has
reviews
provided
coming
a review.
through, but I do note there is one star.
One star.
Is that your mum?
Yeah, I know.
Probably.
We talked about this.
I know
off air.
she likes to
She
take
didn't give
you
any
down.
feedback. It was just a quick punch of the quick 1-star review. I wasn't too happy with it. I did give mum a bit of grief about that
No,
one.
you should do.
No.
It's got to be, or at least someone we know. But if you're other 1-star reviewer,
Bit of feedback though.
bit of feedback. Yeah,
Yes,
let's-
yeah.
we're
Let's
trying to
give us a
fix this
bit of
thing.
a
We're trying to
feedback.
make it good. Everyone else says it's all right. You getting any feedback first episode?
Heaps
people-
of it. We spoke
Yeah.
about this just a second ago, mate. We're getting heaps of feedback, 5-star reviews, and people saying, "Look, it's nice to hear some specific information about property as opposed to general." And to be fair, the first episode was probably a lot more general than what these next few will be, which is it's going to be exciting because I think people are going to get a lot out of this episode, and hopefully a few more that are going to be very similar to this one over the next few months.
Yeah, and the first one was really just a way for us to set up this series, this new podcast, the Pure Property Podcast with Paul Glossop. And you can actually get it on all good podcast channels. It has its own channel that's syndicated, obviously, across the Property Investment Podcast Network as well, so we can make sure you can find it how or wherever you like to tune into it. We're also right across the social media, so welcome for those people tuning in via video. We're back and we're wearing exactly the same clothes. I wear it better, but it's very much a property uniform, though, isn't it?
I'm happy to see some comments below in if anyone's going to watch this via the YouTube videos
Yes.
as well. I'm happy to people to judge who wore it better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you look like you're down to business. You've got your sleeves rolled up.
Sleeves are rolled up.
Whereas I'm a bit more pedestrian in my look, and that's the way I like it to be. My job's just to steer this conversation. And when we set this podcast up in our inaugural episode, it was very much around what are we going to do this differently? And that was my agreement to do this podcast with Paul. Is that okay? Good, I get it. Let's do things differently. And where we got to, where we come to, was let's pull portfolios apart. Let's get people in who are clients of Pure Property Investment and have a chat with them and see how they're going about leveraging and executing the strategies put together by the team at Pure Property. And we have that today. And it's probably how we'll structure most podcasts moving forward.
Yeah, I think so.
Discussions between yourself, Paul, and clients, whether it's over the Zoom or if they come and have a yarn with us. I'm happy to do either or. Very different products in that case. But I've tuned into a conversation that you've had with William, and you'll see it or hear it soon as part of this discussion. And the idea is that much like sports analogies, and we spoke about this in the first podcast, we're going to do the wash up of what's just happened, so we can have a discussion around where people are on their property investment journey. Some of them are at the start of it, some are in the middle of it, some are at the back end of it, and I think William's sort of towards the back end of his property journey, but pulling apart how they did it, what worked, what didn't work, what could be done differently, what could be done better, what was good, what was indifferent, and give some sense, narrative to the science of property investment, but also the actual realities of doing it. And the realities of property investment are very different to what you might read in books or listen on podcasts. When your own attention is doing it, it can be a mess. And this is the way it works. But the better off you can do, and we spoke about this in the first episode, the ability to debrief after every thing that happens, right? It doesn't need to be too formal, but working out, hey, how could we have done that better and what are we going to do next time? And that's very much what we're going to be doing on this podcast series, and I do look forward to it. You've known William for a while, Paul. He's been a client for a while.
Yeah, quite some time. I mean, this is a benefit of being an investment property buyer's agent for coming close on to a decade now. Is that we've got
decade, isn't
close to. Very close to over 8 years, and with that, we've got clients who have been with us for a very long time, and not only buying one property and seeing what the outcome was from one asset, but in William's case, buying many properties to execute on a much more of an aggressive strategy. And if you ask him, he probably would have been more aggressive if he had his time again. But yeah, have known William for close to 8 years or 7 years now, and we still touch base very regularly, even though his buying or his acquisition phase is probably about 2 or 3 years past where it's finished. Our job is to catch up regularly to maximise.
So I don't want to give too much away because we're going to go to the audio, go in the footage shortly with your conversation with William. When did you speak to William? Give
last week.
Time. Okay, it was a last week thing.
Yep.
And you had a discussion over the Zoom.
Correct.
For the purpose of this, or was it a bit of a catch-up? A bit of both?
We catch up typically every 6 months, and to be honest with you, I catch up with most of my existing clients. Typically, we'll reach out every 6 months to have a catch-up. Sometimes it's a very quick debrief, sometimes it's a phone call, sometimes it's a Zoom session to go through numbers and graphs and data. But every 6 months with William, I've probably been catching up with him every 6 months since we started this journey.
Mm. And how did it start with William? How did he find you? Do you remember, or what was the origin of the relationship?
He essentially interviewed me as a potential buyer's agent way back then, back in 2017. I think he interviewed me along with a handful of other buyer's agents at the time. We went through, and he came in with a pretty clear understanding of where his position was and where he wanted to get to. And out of that conversation, I detailed a very clear plan, which in our catch-up, when we cut to it, I go through what that plan was. We go through warts and all where he was, where he wanted to get to. I work through in that conversation essentially what I'd suggest we should be doing, where we should be going. And from that, he took that information, went away and made a decision and engaged us a few weeks later and we went off to the races from there.
Yeah, so how does it work? And a lot of people sort of always ask me, there's a bit of mystery around it. So do people, it's probably the right and wrong language, but do they shop around for a buyer's agent? Like, do they go and interview a whole bunch of them and work out who they want to work with? Is that typical?
I think some do. I think probably back then it was probably more typical because these types of platforms were probably a fair bit more rare, and the information that people could really glean from in the outside media was probably a little bit more difficult to get their handle on. I think this day and age, most people, if they're tuning into the Pure Property podcast or the SPI show or anything of that nature, they're probably hearing different things. Sometimes the messages are, a lot of the time, the messages are quite consistent. But I think what people are able to do now without having to go and interview buyer's agents or property strategists or a combination of the two, similar to mortgage brokers, is they probably get a bit more of a clearer handle as to who they like, what they hear, how that fits within their personal persona, who they think they can get along with. Because we've talked about this for years, Phil, is that you're not just engaging someone to get an outcome. You really should be engaging someone who you can pick up the phone, have a chat with, whether it's a brief chat or get some really clear information on, and someone who you get and gets you. And to be honest with you, we're not all the same. And I've had people who've interviewed me and they didn't engage us, and for their own reasons, and vice versa. We've worked with people or people have engaged us, and we've had to part ways very early in the piece because we realise that, if you're not the right people or you don't get on early in the piece, then you probably know that the long-term outcome's not going to be achieved one way or the other, and people aren't going to be super happy. But yeah, he interviewed us, and I think it's still a relatively common way, but most of the time now when people reach out to us at Pure Property Investment, or if I have that initial conversation, people will know a lot more about our business now before they've even chatted to me.
So they feel as though they know you because of doing stuff like this.
Completely, rightly or wrongly, they'll know what they're kind of getting in for. And we've got a lot of feedback, a lot of reviews, a lot of testimonials, a lot of results, all those things that kind of people make their mind up before they've come to us. I'd say 90% of the time I speak with a client, they've probably already made up their mind. It's more just a validation conversation, and then we get to the point of here's the criteria, here's the strategy, let's get started.
So do you give people a strategy before you get engaged? Like, and I say because a lot of people are going, I'm just going to speak to buyer's agent and they'll tell me what to do and I won't use them.
Yeah, it's
so like, is that the process? You say, here's the strategy, now let's start, and that's when I guess the clock starts, right? Because you get paid for the service that you do.
It's probably one of the most debated parts of the buyer's agency industry, I think personally, and it's been something we've been consistent with since day dot. Some people are very, very closed in on their trade secrets, in air quotes, as far as locations or property types that they think are going to be booming, and that's their intellectual property. Some people, they ring fence it for their own reasons, and others, i.e. pure property investment, we look at it as, hey, look, we're not exposing suburbs which don't exist. We're exposing suburbs which we see for our own reason, validation, that we think are going to outperform the market and are going to fit your budget, going to fit your cash flow. So to answer your question, we typically, in that first catch-up, we're going to be spending a good half an hour, more often than not, sometimes a bit more, to get the information on what we need as far as your current position. And we don't want to hear necessarily all the information, but more so the pertinent financial information, time-sensitive information, what your objectives are. We then take that information to then put it into, here's what we think is going to be realistic, because not every client's going to buy the same property in the same location for the same price and the same cash flow. And they might already have certain assets, so they might have land tax thresholds or exposure, diversification, etc. Out of that conversation, every single time when I catch up with clients for that first time, I will then send back through a much clearer draft, which will likely be a blueprint as to, here's where we are, here's what we think we can do immediately, here's what we would recommend we should be executing on, and that will talk about the locations, the property types, and a lot more of the macro data as far as why we'd suggest that. And then that will probably also fold into a medium-term plan and a long-term plan, which that's the part which we typically would review a bit more, I guess, in-depth, ongoing after we've executed on that next investment or that first investment upfront.
So your value proposition then is the largely the executing, because you can give a plan to someone, but they're still got to execute it. You can say, yeah, sure. I just spent 45 minutes with you and you think you're clever because I've given you a strategy and go and do it yourself.
100%.
I'll see you on the beach, right? We're going to be bidding for the same properties.
Yeah. And I think that therein lies sort of the rub, which, because of our side of things, you buy thousands of properties, you learn things. And it's like any industry, it's like any vocation. And the one thing that we've learned very, very much intently is that we know, especially in the markets that we're buying in, or markets that we have bought in, or markets we're about to buy in, we do so much in-depth detail analysis on not just the property, but the streets, the zoning, comparables, knowing which agents to buy through, knowing which agents to sell through, essentially knowing how to get property off market is a very, very key part of that. We buy hundreds of properties a year, and I would say that out of those hundreds, which has been the same since day one, 95% plus of those are always going to be off market, unadvertised assets. So when it comes down to it, to answer your point, Phil, look, we could say, look, we're not going to send you any information until you pay us a retainer or some form of money to really release that info. I've found that anyone who's genuine and wants to engage us, they want to do it because A, they know they want to advance themselves or their family financially, but B, they know that they don't but they most importantly they know that they don't have the time or the propensity or the ability to actually do what someone does for a living and get as good an outcome. Our fee typically is always going to be made back on the outset from the acquisition price, but as important, people aren't going to be spending their weekends going through open homes. They're not going to be scratching their heads wondering what they're offering. Is that actually price? Is that market? Is that over? Have I done all the research? Do I know the flood overlays, the bushfire overlays, the cash flow breakdowns? Do I know the zoning? Is this orientation correct? Is those school catchments going to benefit me more than that street over, which is a different school catchment? Which one's more beneficial? There's so many other things that go into that. Our job is to say, look, you don't worry about that. That's our job. We'll present the property. You make the decision. And ideally, that's where the value is in our proposition. It's not necessarily saying, here's the suburb that no one else is thinking of that's going to double your money in the next 10 years. It's never that conversation.
Yeah. And, it's how well you play the game is how effective you are when it comes to buying property. There's not that many secrets in property, to be honest with you. We did the big Fast 50 report earlier this year, and we'll catch up on that because I know a lot of the suburbs that we identified are performing pretty well, right? But all the information is out there.
It's free.
It's how you
can download it right now if anyone wants to.
It's really how you execute. So I find it funny, the old was it tire kickers? People going around kicking a car like I'm buying that, but no, thinking they're being clever. But would you say 90+% of all your properties?
95% off market.
So let's just clarify what that is. Unadvertised is different to off market.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Tell me how you.
Well, I guess my definition would be that if we were present a property to you as a client of ours, Phil, and I said, hey, look, we've got this property secured. It's within the locations that we want, the price, and it ticks all the boxes, and we see based on comparables, we think it's good buying. I guess the biggest benefit beyond that is the next part is that saying, hey, in addition to that, it's not going to auction. And secondly, it doesn't have an open home campaign for this Saturday or the following Saturdays or the next 8 weeks until they get the best price. And there's not going to be 10 people going through every single weekend with multiple offers pushing up the price. If you go and look at it on realestate.com, it shouldn't exist on the portals. It should say off market. For us, regardless of whether the property is off market, on market, and the labeling's usually got a whole bunch of different universal terms, what we're trying to do is minimise other people who are
reducing competition.
Reducing competition. I mean, if I'm selling a property, I probably preface this by saying I have actually personally sold property in my own portfolio off market, but I've certainly sold property via auction. Yeah, you essentially want to get the best price. Typically, the best price is going to be established by getting the most amount of people looking at it and outbidding each other to get the market price set. Our job's to do the opposite of that, is that we want to minimise anyone else looking at it. We try to set the price. If the vendor is happy with that price, we minimise any other needs for open homes, holding costs, all those other things. And that's a big part of our value add proposition.
There you go. But this is not a podcast around why you use a buyer's agent, but it's good to get a bit of insight into how it all works. So William was obviously happy when he caught up with you guys because he went, yeah, let's do something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, he's a pretty happy guy in general, to be completely honest with you. But he was generous enough to say, yeah, look, I'm absolutely happy. Because I think one thing that William's learnt and probably has become a big advocate on over the years is that, again, going back to your point, Phil, is that there's not that many secrets out there. And that the biggest thing he wants to impart is that, hey, most people can do this. Don't feel like just because you doubt yourself or you think that what you want to achieve is kind of that unattainable position. He's testament to the fact that he had a plan, he had a starting position, and he went and executed on it. And he's like, I just want to share the goodwill because that's what allows more people to get to better positions long term. And
this is why he's happy to come and have a chat with you and pull his portfolio apart, right?
100%.
He's fine.
Yeah.
No worries.
Completely.
It's good paying forward the karma.
Absolutely. And he's very much a paying it forward type of guy. And I think we've probably worked with a good dozen or so of his friends and family who they've had conversations with over the years as well. And it's essentially just paying forward the fact that saying, hey, give this guy a call. I reckon there's probably something that can be done that's going to put you in a better position than what you're otherwise going to achieve over the next 20 years.
I guess that's the sort of business you like to generate, right?
Completely. It's the number one type of business because it's goodwill business. It's people who have the right mindset, aren't looking to make money tomorrow, and essentially just trying to incrementally better their retirement or their kids' position or a combination of those things.
Well, you do talk about that with William in this conversation. We'll throw over to the audio or the video, depending how you're engaging with us right now. Before we give too much away, it's probably best if we hear what William's got to say, and then we can come back and we can sort of pull it all apart and see what he's doing. Over to the video and the audio. We'll be back as soon as Paul's chat with William is over. Back in a moment.
Thank you, firstly, for joining me, William. And I know, Bud, we've known each other for quite some time now. As professionally, we obviously started working together best part of 7 years ago. As you know, this is a segment that we've got within the Pure Property podcast that we want to really explore a bit more of the real life stories of how investors got to where they got to, what their goals were, how close to those goals did they actually get, what did they do wrong, what did they do right, what's their portfolio made up of, and learning some really, hopefully, valuable lessons along the way that others can take some of the information and hopefully can use the good bits and also understand what the bad bits are to avoid those mistakes. So for you and I today, William, mate, hopefully what I want to let the audience probably understand a little bit more first and foremost is probably just a bit of your backstory. Why did you choose property first and foremost as your wealth creation vehicle? Because you know full well that there's certainly different ways that everyone can make money in the world, but why did property become the main vehicle for you to use, you and your family to use to make wealth over the long term?
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul. When I was a bit younger, I tried to have the breakthrough of my career, which wasn't too successful. So that's the first start, and then second, and I had a look at share trading. I study a fair bit of it. Stocks trading, options, short calling, and all that, but that involved a lot of time. So much time that it's and at the same time, I don't have the capital to do it. The leverage itself isn't as good. So I was looking for something that I can do it part-time. I'm doing my full-time job during the day so that I can increase my wealth day by day, night by night, that I can go to sleep. If I do stockbroking or share trading, I will probably have to spend a good 3 to 4 hours every day by being involved into the stock market, which that means it's more or less like an extra part-time job.
Yeah,
so, and also the leverage is not as good, because property you can borrow, you can put 10% deposit or 20% deposit, then you can borrow 80 to 90%. Sometimes with RMI you can borrow up to 100%. So the leverage is far substantially more. And when I study property through books, there are not that many podcasts at the time, so it's mainly through books and seminar. I find that for the last 50 years, the property market of Australia has been going up consistently, not a one shot going up, but consistently. And also the interest rate comes in through the cycle. So if I can act on the time when the interest rate cycle was low, then I can maximize my opportunity. That's how I started.
Thank you, buddy. And I think if I'm sort of crystallizing that down to two main things that I heard there is property for you, after exploring a range of other options, the power of leverage is probably one of the things which is quite unique to property itself. And then the second part is time, and that it's as much as I don't, and we both know full well that property is not truly a passive investment, and no investing is truly passive.
I don't mean by it's a passive that I don't need to do anything. I still have to act on it. I still have to talk to you. I still have to talk property manager. I still have to deal with a lot of things. But at the time that I can control. But if I look at the stock market, if I look at a United States stock market, I have to wake up in the middle of the night to go through all.
Correct.
If I look, there are time constraints.
Yeah, and it's the hours that are invested. So time and leverage, it sounds like they're the two main things. So I guess if we cast our time and also our minds back to when we first caught up and when you first set up a meeting to chat with myself, and I think it was relatively early in 2017 from memory.
Yeah,
so
that's right, 2017.
So we were both much younger, and probably no doubt
less grey hair.
Less grey hair, far less grey hair. But let's try to pump our tires up a little bit and talk about the happy things, mate. But 2017, we first caught up. So probably the question I wanted to ask you is, and I know at the time you had spoken to quite a number of other buyers agents before. Yes, well, not a number, but a number of other buyers agents before you ended up engaging our services. Would you mind sharing with the listeners, I guess, what were some of the key things that you were looking for within a buyer's agent? Because you obviously had a career, you were busy at the time, you knew you had a goal and you had a target that you wanted to get to, but you also realized that you needed help, so you wanted to engage professionals to get that help. What were some of the things that I guess led you to, or what were some of the key considerations and what led you to choosing pure property investment at the time?
Well, I study and invest in property before I met you in 2019.
2017.
Oh, sorry, 2017. That time flies. So I understand that after I study and after I invest in properties for a while, I understand that for me, the max I can buy property maybe once or twice in a couple of years. So I don't have that expertise. And when I study the reports, by the time when I'm reading the report, am I really in touch with the market pulse? I really know what's going on day by day, week by week, how the cycle runs. I purchased some purely by myself, and the result are okay because time can heal a lot of mistakes. But I couldn't maximize my opportunity at the time if I knew what I was doing or if I can get the expertise. So that's why I start to, after a few properties, start to reach out to a few buyers agents, and I interview every one of them. My aim was looking for their expertise and how they will, what's their theme, what's their idea. Some may be doing dual, some may be doing development, some may be doing, I look for what are their themes and how it would tie into my ideas.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah,
fair enough, mate.
These are the things that I was looking for. And also at the same time, I look for their interaction skills. Do they just want to sell me something? Do they just sell me a land and then build a new place on it? Or do they actually want to create the whole portfolio with me consistently through the years? Because I have that plan. I have that plan of 10 years. I have that goals, which you probably remember by bringing that big spreadsheet of you.
Absolutely.
Of
and
mine,
we've had
and
multiple iterations.
Where I wanted to be, by the time I'm 50 years old, and how I want to do it. And I had the idea.
Yep.
I just
and that's a great
someone
segue.
to help me out.
Completely. And I think that's the perfect segue, mate, because I think as we had that first meeting, which was quite an involved meeting, because at that time we unpacked where you were. We also unpacked that not just the short-term goals, but also where we wanted to get to in that 6 years to 10-year time frame. And we're not too far off that right now. And I think it's probably one thing I've just done as part of this podcast is I've brought up what our top line objectives were from a short-term, medium-term, and we deemed them to be long-term objectives back then. And I'm going to, if it's okay with yourself, I just want to share with the listeners, I guess, a little bit about where we started, and I guess what we were trying to execute on. And you can maybe flesh out a little bit more about what we actually did, what properties we bought, where we bought, why we bought them, what the outcome's been since then. So if I look at the position in 2017, you had your principal place of residence, you also had an investment at that time, and we had a pretty strong position. You'd done an equity cash out with your... Remembering that was actually whilst we were going through the Royal Commission into the banking sector. So finance actually wasn't really that straightforward then either. So I guess for any of the listeners who are only just starting to think about it now, finance hasn't been easy for a long time. 2017 certainly was no exception. It was a difficult time to attain finance. So we set some lofty goals, and we were going through a challenging period to actually access money. But at that time, we had an 8-year goal to within your property portfolio of circa 2.7, 2.8 is where we wanted to get to. And we wanted to get to a weekly income goal of around about $1,500 to $1,600 a week net. That's what we wanted to achieve, because ultimately what that was going to allow you to do was then make choices on what you do with your time, because we knew if we could replace X amount of income, and you realize from your spendings that if you could get to this position, then that would allow you to have the freedom of choice, which we can talk about a little bit later in the podcast as to what you choose to do with your time now, because we talked off air a little bit, and we talk regularly about what you choose to do off air, and we share a few war stories, but we'll get to that. So that was sort of the top line position. Now, I guess to get there, we had to make some pretty aggressive steps. Now, we had a good amount of equity available. At that time, we harvested equity out of your principal place of residence and your investment. And I think at the time we had somewhere around about $700,000 or $800,000 available that we wanted to actually utilize. Now, we wanted to get aggressive, so we had to utilize that at the maximum possible. And remembering too that we weren't necessarily going back to that theme of actually borrowing. You weren't that attractive to the big four. So we had to go down the pathway of non-bank lenders, et cetera. So it wasn't just say, hey, we went and knocked on the door of CBA and said, can I please have a 20% LVR loan, and let's go down that pathway 10 times over. We were talking about Pepper, we were talking about Liberty, we were talking about the non-banks, the non-conformings back then as well. So the intention in the very short term, so we had about a two-year goal at that time to gain exposure to ideally 5 or 6 investments, to get a total exposure of somewhere between $2 to $2.5 million in total assets, in addition to where we were. And we wanted those properties to essentially have a bit of a blend of ability to develop, renovation, add value to, but also they needed to see some really decent cash flow positions immediately, because we had to keep this portfolio afloat. You didn't have the surplus cash flow to say, hey, look, I can withstand a 50 or 100 grand a year negative straight away. That just simply wasn't the case. And nor is it the case for most people, let's be honest. So that was that sort of short-term goal. Then we had a medium-term goal. And again, these short-term, medium-term, long-term timeframes aren't necessarily what I set for everyone. I think they're depending on your requirements. We had about a 3 to 4 year target, and that was still our acquisition phase, to look at 3 additional assets to build into the portfolio in 2019 and 2020. And that was sort of focusing on that 350 to 400K price point at that time. Again, cash flow neutral was still quite important. And we wanted to make sure that the entire portfolio could in some way, shape or form be pretty much neutralized across all the assets. Now, some were more growth, some were more cash flow, some were more future development. But we wanted to get the total portfolio value to circa $6.5 million by the end of 2020. And then we also wanted to make sure we kept cash flow somewhere around about neutral pre-tax where possible. And then that fed into our long-term targets, which were sort of, we blended that to about 6 to 10 years was our long-term goal. And we're kind of smack bang in that long-term position right now. We wanted to then look at, that was the consolidation / development or renovation phase, and potentially partly sell down assets to then create that cash flow position. So I think after we did execute on that short and medium term, what we did then is that we didn't buy any more property necessarily after that, but we certainly caught up regularly, and we still do catch up regularly to assess all these goals, to tinker around the edges, look at selling, look at, do we rise rents? Do we look at renovating? Is it granny flat time? Is it subdivision time? And we go through that conversation quite regularly. But I guess the 6 to 10 year target was, we wanted a total mortgage position of around about total equity position, total asset base, factoring in 6% average annual growth by year 8 or 2024. We wanted to have a total value of around about 8 to 8.5 million. We probably assumed that our mortgages would be somewhere between 5.2 to 5.7 million at that time if we executed on that strategy. And we wanted to then say that that would have us a gross equity position of somewhere around about $2.5 to $2.8 million. That was the plan. So if anyone wants to listen to that, it was a very aggressive
ambitious plan.
Very much so. So, obviously what the listeners are going to want to know is that, okay, well, look, it's great to set these really lofty goals and go and often try to buy a whole bunch of assets and have them grow in value, balance your cash flow, and then ideally have a big net income over time. But it's 2023, we're only 1 year off the end of that plan coming to fruition. Now it's 2023 and the back end of 2023. What everyone wants to know is, I guess, where did we end up? So if you don't mind, mate, what it might be really valuable, and I don't think we need to go into the nitty-gritties of every property, but maybe take the listeners through what we started with, how we built the portfolio, and what did we do at the end of it all? Essentially, where are we now?
So we start out with a really ambitious plan that we nutted out gradually, one by one. Every couple of months, we buy one property. I see my broker,
He stresses a little bit more every time.
Stresses a little bit more every time when I ask for a new loan. But because with the good selections of the properties, we managed to control the cash flow. We managed to do some short-term growth, some from Tasmania, which by now have exceeded over 100%. I looked at it, the 6 or 7 properties that we've all got, the average is about over 60% growth, which is what we really target for. So it was good. It was very, very good that we could achieve those results. And
where did the assets end up getting selected? Just for the listeners' sake. So we started. I know you mentioned we've got a couple of properties in the Tasmanian market.
Yeah, and Queensland, Brisbane.
Yep.
Yeah, and these are the 2 main areas we focused at the time, because at that time the cycles was there for the properties to grow. One thing that I regret, I didn't get anything in Perth. I didn't get anything in Adelaide, but so be it. What can you do? You can only maximize your time and opportunity at the right time.
Yeah, and I think that wasn't through lack of trying from my end. I certainly was trying to push you to getting those exposure into those 2 areas. But I think at that time, I guess the good part about that story, the reason why we didn't, is that A, we'd maxed out the borrowing as per the plan. But B, we also had the exposure that we tried to get, that we knew would get us to where we needed to get to as well. So as much as having those additional assets would have helped, it certainly didn't hinder us getting to that. So The property types, what were the predominant theme of the property types? Were they apartments? Were they villas? Were they freestanding established
They're
houses?
just freestanding established house. The main key was low maintenance.
Yep.
So that we don't spend too much money just to cover the maintenance. We done some for land banking purposes, so that potentially later on can be bought by developers when the time is right. And main thing is to manage the cash flow, to keep the portfolio living, alive. Through the times, through the different rate cycle times, so that we can manage the portfolio and let it grow by itself.
Yeah, exactly, mate. So I think there's probably a couple of key things there that we're very much focused on within Pure Property now, is that asset type as to what grows best over time historically has always been established freestanding property with a decent land component. And I know, working on and acquiring the assets within your portfolio in partnership with you and also with my team, is that the properties they were relatively vanilla. I mean, some of them were a little bit out of the box. Predominantly, they were off market. Some of them had higher density land opportunities. Some of them had granny flat opportunities, which you've executed on in different areas. But when it came down to it, overall, they were basically neutrally geared major CBD locations and capital city locations. They certainly weren't mining towns. They certainly weren't.
None come with the glossy brochure
No.
that attract my wife. Every time my wife questioned me, why am I buying an old 1960 or 1975 building? What's the catch of that? I said the catch is the dollar.
Exactly. And I think probably the last thing to reiterate there before I sort of ask you what do we end up with, is you mentioned cash flow was essentially to keep the portfolio alive, and I guess I liken cash flow to kind of watering the garden. Is that you can plant the plants, but if you don't have the cash flow, they won't grow, and eventually they'll die. Sometimes it's a slow death, depending on if we're at La Nina or Nino. But ultimately, and that's kind of like, well, the weather is more or less the interest rates of the time. But if you don't have the cash flow, which comes in regardless of what the weather is, you can't water the plants in, and essentially they just can't survive, regardless of how good the growth is. If you can't hold them, they're as good as redundant. And I think that's the part, is that cash flow for us. And for your instance too, William, is that cash flow doesn't mean that every property for every investor needs to be neutral. Sometimes we need to actually be well and truly positive because people are on very limited incomes. But other times we've got higher income earners who don't need it to be neutral. But we might be specifying, hey, look, we can absorb 5-7 grand a year negative because we know this will be more of a growth asset. I guess cash flow can mean different things to different people, but we set that criteria specific to your portfolio. So walk me through, William. So we obviously had a very aggressive sort of 3 or 4 year take on trying to build this portfolio to around about that $8.5 million price point, with about a $5.5 million debt, or $5.7 million debt is what we modeled out. Where did we get to? Because we've obviously finished the buying phase or the acquisition phase quite some time ago. Where did you end up getting to? Now it's end of 2023. How many properties are in the portfolio? What's the total gross value? What's the approximate debt in the portfolio these days?
Probably I would say we've got about 10 properties now in the portfolio, with a over $10 million in asset value. The RMI, the loan value ratio is about 45%.
Okay.
Yeah, so which I'm sitting very comfortably. And that I can just still see another cycle growing without too much stress or hassles. So then we'll just keep letting it run, and then hopefully from a small plan, small seed, to now a plan that we can see maybe become a tree later on.
Absolutely. And it's and I guess that goes back to the first step here that we really honed in on, and we spoke, and we do speak still a lot about this, is that anyone's ideas are fantastic, but without a plan, you really struggle to execute with any kind of real outcome. And I think probably where I give you a lot of credit for, William, is that you didn't just choose us, a Pure Property Investment, to be a buyer's agent and property strategist. You also came to us with pretty clear goals. You came up to us with a pretty clear plan. And you were very willing to say, look, I realize that this isn't going to be achieved without some hard work, some punishing times, a lot of paperwork, a lot of decisions, a lot of conversations. But, we fast forward 7 years as to where we started, and we've now worked towards a portfolio that's probably got the best part of $5 million in actual gross equity. The cash flow, from what I know, well and truly exceeds that sort of $1,500 a week goal that we set out, even in these times of 6% interest rates or more. And I think the other thing and the big point that you just made there too, is that we've kind of only really gone through one full phase of a growth cycle in the last 7 or 8 years. If we fast forward another 15 years or even 10 years, and we get that second growth cycle from this compounded moment of $10 million in a gross value in your portfolio, at a 5% annualized rate, you're talking a $20 million portfolio within the next 14 or 15 years.
We can have another chat by then.
Exactly. And I guess the beauty is that because cash flow is positive, well and truly positive now, we're at the point where the reality is if it does play out that way, fantastic. If it goes stronger, even better. If it goes less, it doesn't really determine the outcome, because your cash flow is there, your growth is there, you've got a huge amount of equity that you could sell off if and when you did choose to. But I guess going back to the point here is that you started with a very clear plan. We ended up executing on that plan pretty much within those months and those years that we outlined. We're at a point now where we're not buying any more property. We certainly are catching up regularly, but I guess to round out our conversation now, because we could go on about so many different little bits and pieces within this portfolio. I know we've got property in Hobart, Launceston, we've got property right across the Brisbane market. We talked about buying in Adelaide and Perth, but we kind of got to the point of saying, do we need to? Can we get the finance, or should we be comfortable with where we are? Those two markets in general, in addition to your Sydney assets, which you had originally, have played out exactly as we wanted and planned to. But that being said, and credit to you, mate, because you've got to a point which most envy, and you haven't done it with a huge additional income that most people are going to say they don't have. And knowing your finances, not to divulge, but you're not on a position where you're not a 7-figure salary earning family. You started, you got aggressive, you took chances where you knew those risks were calculated, but you did something about it. But that being said, there's always going to be regrets. And I know we talked about a couple there. And you've been in the property industry as far as an investor now, and you're still an avid property, I'll call you a property geek to a degree, because you like to stay interested in it. And it's something that you still stay wise with, because I know you talk to a lot of your friends and family about property quite regularly as well. If you had your time again and you were going to buy that first investment, or alternatively, you had already bought investments and you wish you did something a little bit differently, if you had one piece of advice for the younger William, who was still keen on fishing but still wanted to get as much time on his hands as he possibly could to spend it with his family and doing the things that he enjoyed, but if you could reflect back on that last 10, 15 years of investing actively right across Australia, what's the one thing that you would do differently, and potentially what's the one thing that you would do more of if you had your time again?
It wouldn't be one, it would be a few.
Okay. All right. I tried to limit it to one, but you give me those few.
First one is dream bigger. Even at that time, we were ambitious. We were thinking like, wow, can we do it? But we should have dreamed even bigger, because we should have maximized the lower interest rate cycle at the time we had.
Yep.
Second thing is, after 2019, after we purchased a few properties, I start to lose my interest in work. I don't look for promotions anymore. Which I should have. If I work a little bit more harder at work, pretending to be working a little bit more at work, I would have get my pay rise, and then I can fund my properties portfolio even better. These are the things that I should have done better. I mean, I'm not regretting I didn't do it, but I'm thinking that these are the things that I could have done better at the time.
And asset selection wise, is there anything in the assets that we've bought over the time that you wish you did more of or less of, or is there ideally sort of same?
I look for things that I know what I'm looking for, but at the same time, do we have that opportunity at that time? When there were times that we could have a few options in our hands, we could only make the best decision at the time that we could. So every time when I come to you and say, hey, we're ready, I got my pre-approval done, then you will give me a few different options to look at.
Yeah.
So it's not that we don't have any options.
Yeah.
It's not that William, we can only buy this one. No, you never come back to me like that.
No, agreed.
Right? We always have a few options available. And then we just analyze it at that time. What was the best decision at that time? So we make those decisions. So, I mean, in terms of regret, there can't be any regret because we've gone through a thorough process to do our investment.
Completely, mate. And I guess to recap on that, I'm so happy for you to hear that come out of your mouth, mate, because so often that's probably and we go back to those two quintessential regrets that I hear most property investors who have the benefit of hindsight. Investors who are starting out, unfortunately, don't have hindsight, so you'll only learn those lessons 10, 15, 20 years down the track. But the first one you said, which resonates so much with me, and I think so much with so many people, is dream bigger. Don't let your own preconditioned experiences or what people have told you.
I let my salary at the time restrict my imagination,
100%,
restrict my ambitions.
And I think that's so valuable for anyone. And if you don't get the answer you want from someone, speak to someone else. And it's not to say that people can do anything they want at any stage. I don't think we need to be unrealistic about that. But you had the means, you also had the time, and you had the ambition to want to get to a much bigger place. You probably could have, we've achieved some amazing things.
We probably have 20 properties by now.
Well, that's it. And it might not be, and I guess we've never been a big.
It's not about the numbers. It's about how much you can achieve for that golden time.
Exactly. And I think the second point that you also mentioned, mate, and I think this is a very important part for me to always also reinforce to anyone who's a would-be property investor and a listener or someone who has already started their portfolio, is as much as property can grow in value, property is always a game of leverage. And we spoke about this right at the start, is that why you chose property is leverage. But leverage is only achievable when you can show that you can repay the debt. Now, repaying the debt to the bank is your rent that you collect from the property, but it's also your income. Now, you mentioned that you kind of lost a bit of focus and ambition at work. And like you said, if that ended up resulting in a 50 grand pay rise over the next 3 or 4 years, you then all of a sudden say, well, if I got that pay rise,
but we made that within the first 2 years of our portfolio.
And that's the challenging part, because then you say, well, mate, like you put more time in your property portfolio and you made millions in there. So it's a double-edged sword, I guess. But I think to that point is that you can't build property portfolios without an income. So I think that's the key part here, is that we don't become delusional in saying just because you've got cash or equity doesn't mean you can go and do what you want. You still need to work hard. You still need to make sure you maintain a job, at least while you're building the portfolio.
And study the cash flow game.
Completely. And I think you've become quite a master in managing your cash flow. And that's something that we do regularly when we do catch up, is we don't necessarily talk too much more about growth and equity in the portfolio. It's more, hey, this interest rate's coming off fixed to variable. The rent's here. What do you think we should do? Is it time to do X, Y, Z? Sometimes there's nothing that we can suggest to do. Right. Other times there's small tweaks. Other times there's larger things that might have to happen. And that might even eventuate in selling certain assets. But it's a constant part of that process. It's not just one decision and we let it go for the rest of its time. So
if it's a long-term investment, that means you have to put in the long-term effort. You can't.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love it, buddy. I love it, mate. I think we're going to catch up in a few, hopefully for the listeners, we might try to do this in a few months or years' time and probably rehash on. Not 20 years. No, 100%. We'll do it before then, but we'll talk about well and truly before what's happened between now and then. But I want to say thank you again, buddy, because obviously you've given your time to explore and open up, I guess, where you started, what you've achieved, and some of the lessons learned along the way. I'm sure that's a lot of the listeners will take some really good understanding as to some of these big lessons in here, which the big one, dream bigger. The second one is make sure that you manage your cash flow. And really nothing's really achievable without a crystal clear plan, and executing on that plan, which you've done in spades, is always going to be the number one aspect, which without the execution, any plan is essentially redundant. And I think that's what you've done, mate, is that you plan very well, but the thing that we work together on is we executed on that plan quite aggressively, and it's led to exceeding those goals and getting you to a position where where you effectively don't have to focus too much on work anymore. You choose when and where, and I know you spend a lot more time fishing than probably what you did 7 or 8 years ago.
Yes, and I'm truly grateful that we have gone through this journey together.
Absolutely.
And, I set out the target myself to walk out on my own terms from work when I'm 50 years old. And luckily, we have already achieved that goal. So I walked away last year and I haven't looked back.
That's amazing, mate. It puts a big smile on the face.
Before I turned 50.
Well before, and for anyone who's
catching
not
the fish of my lifetime.
Absolutely, and I've seen some of those catches, and that's a big one. Is that anyone who's listening, and we might even be, if William's okay with it, I might actually attach a photo of that fish of a lifetime. I think it was from memory, was it a black kingfish from memory? Was it cobia?
Cobia, 33 cobia.
There you go. And that wouldn't have been line. I guess that the point is that wouldn't have been caught if you were working, because ultimately it was caught at a time where you chose to
calling in sick. I was
But I guess that was only achieved because of what property allowed you to do, which was your time, take time off work and spend it on the things that you really enjoy doing. And I think it was tagged and released for any listeners as well, wasn't it? It was out there to fight another day.
After a 55 minutes fight, I promised the fish I'll let it go.
Amazing, mate. I love it. All right, but we'll certainly catch up soon, and thank you again for sharing your story with everyone.
Thanks, Paul. Much appreciated.
All right, welcome back, everyone. It's Phil Tarrant, co-host of the Pure Property Podcast with Paul Glossop. I have in the studio with me Paul Glossop, who you've just been listening to or watching, having a chat with William, one of the clients of Pure Property Investment, and obviously Paul Glossop is the founder and director of that business. So you're still pretty hands-on then with your clients. You don't sort of sit in the shadows now and don't get involved. You're still right. That's what you do.
The vast majority of my time that I spend is exactly what we just listened to. It's setting the strategy, executing on the strategy, making sure we follow up, make tweaks where necessary. Rectify any issues that sit there, and keep redirecting the ship to get it as close to where we want to get to as possible.
And recalibrating along the way is the very essence of smart property investment. You can see that's what William's done in conjunction with Paul. You can see you guys get on as well. So to our point earlier on about choosing your buyer's agent, you got to probably have a bit of chemistry there, right?
Definitely. And it's no different to anyone who's been investing for a short time, long time. You're probably thinking people like your mortgage broker, people like your accountant in some stages. If you're a property investor already, you've probably been through or might already have good property managers, people who you can just pick up the phone and speak to and just get good, honest information and advice when you want it, and really get those people on your side. And once you've got them, don't let them go.
Yeah. Well, there you have it. So do you reckon he's happy, William?
Oh, but I think people would have gauged that. You probably see on the video if you engage by that way, but you probably hear it in his voice as well. He smiles a lot, William, and it's not just because his property portfolio is done really well, but I think he's probably got the right mindset, is that property's not, and if anyone goes back through some of those key points, the key part here is that property's not passive, and he's probably a big advocate to say if anyone who wants to buy property think you buy it and you come back in 10 years and you've done nothing and you expect it to all be smooth sailing, you're wrong, because he's certainly not going to advocate saying I do nothing, but he certainly has made sure that, he talked about the fact that he looked at a couple of different options up front, especially when he did a big equity release to get started. He looked at the options of the stock market and equities, and he thought, well, that's a very active way. And when we say active, that is like literally 3 to 4, 5 hours actively every day trading, trying to put shorts and options in place.
That's
and
heavy going.
It's very, and he's certainly clever enough to know that that's not what he wanted. But also knew that leverage was the other big part. So control and leverage was the big parts that he chose property on, as far as why that was the vehicle. He executed, and he certainly didn't hesitate. He constantly was buying, then going back through the process, conversation with the broker, then making sure that the money was there, the equity was there, the cash flow was there to push to number 2, to push number 3, push right up to building that portfolio to north of $10 million in total value and south of $5 million in total debt. And ultimately, that upfront goal that we had of circa $1,500 a week net was achieved at about bit over $2,000 a week net. And that testament to him is that, we selected really good assets that averaged way beyond the market average over that 7 odd years that we bought those assets for. But when it comes down to it, someone has to make the decision. I'm not the one who's borrowing the money. I'm not the one who's signing the contracts. William's the one, and his wife are the ones who made the decision to get busy and actually make sure that they took control of where their destiny is. And now he's at the point where he works part-time, fishes full-time, and does what he wants with his time, as opposed to what he doesn't want to do and is forced into that longer position that he would otherwise be in. I mean, he's probably 15 years expedited his working career by choice.
That's good. Do you reckon he would be happy staying like that?
Time will tell.
Yeah.
One thing I won't stop doing is Will and I, we will catch up regularly, and regardless of whether he's actively buying property, which he's not anymore.
Well, he'd struggle these days because the bank probably wouldn't give him any more debt.
But he's still got. I mean, he's still got a property portfolio. And a
Yeah.
lot of that's held in trust, and that will still allow for borrowings per se. But he's certainly a position and someone to say, well, he had a good why. As why is he doing it? And he wanted to buy time. And he didn't want to do it to buy other things. You know, he's an avid fisherman, he's an example, but he doesn't own a boat. He doesn't want to own a boat because he knows that boats are expensive. So he's, as much as he...
So he's got lots of friends that have boats?
And he pays to go on charters when he wants to. Guess what? He's like, I want to go and try and catch Spanish mackerel. I'm going to fly up the coast and I'm going to get in a fancy boat and it's going to take me out and that's going to cost me a few grand.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to own a boat, sail it up there and go through that process. But I guess to my point there is that, he had a plan, he executed on it, and he really understands that he still, even though he is probably dialed back from work. Whether he goes back and works more, I think he's the kind of person where
he has a choice, right?
He's really content in doing what he does. And certain people just aren't. I know you aren't, Phil. I'm probably not either. Even if the finances were taken care of, would we sit back and want to fish every day? I do like fishing. I do like surfing.
You couldn't pay me to fish every day.
I know you couldn't. But I think to this point, right? Like, would you be tinkering around and doing whatever you want to do at the home? Probably. Would you spend more time with the kids where possible? Probably. Would you spend more time with your wife doing other things? Probably. But again, these are all the things that I think by choice. Will he sit back and do it that way? Maybe not. And I'd like to probably do an update in 6 months, 12 months and figure out, because he's kind of at this early stage of a semi-retirement.
Yeah, you hear all the time. I know lots of guys and girls who have done it and they just go, yeah, it was great for 3 months and then I hated it.
Yeah. Completely.
Then they try and re-engage and reconnect, and you know what? Like, if you're good, you can sort of get stuck back in. The question I have though, and it's something that come up as part of the discussion. So we had a principal place of residence, which he'd done well out of.
Yep.
Which was an enabler for investing in property. He had one investment property.
Correct.
And he did nothing for ages.
He didn't. No, for a vast number of years.
Why didn't he do it?
Years.
Like, did he get what was his aha moment where he went, I'm messing around here?
I think it was work. So he was very early in a career, and he wasn't in a low-paying job per se, but he was in a career where the trajectory could have been steep, but there was a trade-off for that. Like most careers, especially corporate, is that if you want to get to the next ladder and then 10 more rungs up the ladder, there's time commitment, there's sacrificing other things. And to his admission, he spent a good few years trying to climb that ladder and kind of realised that A, he probably wasn't as good or as clever as some of his peers, and B, he realised that property, when he reflected back, he's like, hang on a second, I've got these two assets, they've grown this much in value over that same time, and I'm trying to get to a point where my pay can go from X to Y, and let's say it goes from 150 grand to 300 grand. Let's say he doubles his salary in a 5-8 year period of time, and then maybe even goes to doubling that again. He kind of realised that the time commitment involved versus if I still put that same time in. So that was probably a 5 to 7 year time frame where he realised that I'm spending this time trying to get here, but I could probably, based on what's happened in the past from property, I could probably get there, but with a lot less effort from my work and a lot more time put into the property side of things. And that's where that divergence happened, and where he made that clear decision. So I think property is going to be the vehicle. Let's get busy.
And do you see that with a lot of your clients where they get a taste of property and go, okay, all right, I sort of get how this works. Let me do more.
Definitely.
Yeah,
absolutely. But the doubters and the skeptics are always the ones who look at the yesteryears and the boomers and what they got out of their portfolio and say that'll never happen again and it's never going to be available for me, or I just can't do it. It's the doers, who are even the Gen Xers, the Gen Ys, the millennials. They're there now, and they're the ones who realize, saying, look, if it's meant to be, it's up to me type of scenario, and they'll get there. And then when they get that first taste of it, we've gone through a 2 or 3 year growth cycle, we went through a 2 or 3 year flat cycle, we went through a 2 or 3 year growth cycle behind that, so on and so forth. It's when they go through that, even if it's an early stage of one cycle, they look back and they think, hang on a second, I've just bought a $400,000 asset and I just got revalued 4 years later and it's worth $600,000. And all I had to do there was answer a few emails. I had a bit of running repairs, maintenance, and maybe it cost me $3, $4, $5 a year to get to that position. Now, granted, we might have just went through a purple patch, but even if it was half that and I bought for 400, spent 30, 40 grand in costs, and maybe even it made me 50 grand growth in 3 or 4 years' time. And they start to do the reverse math and saying, well, how long does it take me to save 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 grand? A lot of the time people are like, that's a year's worth of work, and I just made that by acting.
Yeah.
And they think, well, imagine if I did that 5 times over the next 20 years.
And that's the aha moment for
the penny
for
drops.
most people.
Yeah.
For most people, and it's good to see. Look, I think the key takeaway for me when I watched the discussion you had with William was around execution.
Yep.
Like everything comes down to just flawless execution. Like a lot of people have got grand plans and schemes, and you might have a really good strategy, you might have it all mapped out, but it's how well you execute it is really going to make or break it. Do you think he could have done more? I've got some views on it, but do you think he could have done? I reckon he could have gone harder or faster, or was he redlining the whole way through?
No. So if I was honest, and if he's honest, and some of the biggest feedback, and I always try to ask this question at the end of those types of interviews, is the advice for the first time investor or a younger William. He's people have just listened into it, and you would have heard that the resounding part is that he would have dreamt bigger. He wouldn't have been restricted probably, and as much as he executed, he had a pretty grand vision here, and he executed pretty flawlessly. But if he had his
was
time
that
again,
his vision or was it your vision?
That was a combination. So he was definitely.
He owned the vision.
He owned the vision.
He said it was his vision.
Yeah,
he claimed it as his vision.
Exactly, and I'm not going to take credit for that. He was relatively aggressive, but I think in retrospect, he could have done more sooner. Big thing here is that he didn't go down the traditional path of big four banks and conforming lenders.
I was going to ask you that because he went down the path, and I know you sort of put it in the front end of the strategy was to use non-major banks.
You had to. And you had to pay more for money because we're up front to say, mate, if we want to get here, you realise that we're not going to be able to conform with where the majority of the big fours and the deposit
PAYG.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
So you constrained by your income and multiples of it, but then you've got to go to the non-conforming. You've got to pay more in interest. You've got to budget that into your cash flows. There's all kinds of additional fees. So all those things that we know that once you get to a point, you have to push different ways and different avenues. Good broker. To set the strategy, but being comfortable saying, I know I'm going to pay more for my money. I'm okay with that because the multiplier is going to be a payoff 10 times what I know the cost is going to be. But dreaming bigger was his resounding feedback to himself. If he could say it again 8 years prior, he's like, William, do more because ultimately the pie gets bigger as long as you control the cash flow.
And you get that a lot from investors when they. So I always say it. I could have gone twice as hard early days. But does his principal place of resident thrown into that $10 million as total asset base?
No, it's separate to that.
It's separate to
that. Yeah.
See, I look at the numbers. Like the smart property investment portfolio at its peak was worth about $10 million. It wasn't delivering $1,500 a week in positive.
No,
like far from it.
Yep.
So I sit there and just go, I don't know. The numbers don't work for me. I said this is my reaction to it. I go, don't know about that. And this was built at a time when interest rates were, I don't know, probably 2.5%, 2.5%, maybe 3% he was paying.
They're higher at the early stages.
Because
so 2017, 18, 19, and then they came down, and then they going to come back up. But I guess the key here is that
a lot of people say it's hard to make good positive returns off resi property.
100%. And I guess if you go back to the details in that actual interview with William, is that the reality of where his position is, it wasn't just built by prices going up and rents going up, and all of a sudden he's just got this huge positive surplus. Essentially, it was buy, execute quite aggressively. Prices went up, and what he's done there is he's taken money off the table incrementally as he's gone. So he definitely doesn't hold the same portfolio that we built. He's taken money off the table. He's sold a few assets. He's also added a granny flat to 2 assets. He's also bought commercial assets in there, which were higher cash flow. And then from there, that combination of those two different things, coupled with the previous assets that he's held, and then selling a couple of those assets, taking that profit off the table, has then allowed him to reduce the LVR to well below 50%. And he's only held assets which are actually, he intentionally wants to hold the assets which are higher in cash flow, not necessarily higher in growth anymore. So they're the properties which have got the higher cash flow, they've got the commercial asset, and they've got the granny flat assets in there. There's no intention of selling those assets. And that was by design. It wasn't to say, we're going to build granny flats on assets and then sell them. There's no point in that, really. Vast majority of the time, you're not going to make the money you spend on those types of purchases. But it was intentionally saying we build with a combination of growth assets with development upside, some that are purely just focused on commercial, and cash flow. And then at the end, we start to then think about how do we reduce debt, increase cash flow. And that's going to be a process ongoing because there are certainly assets in there which you'll probably still part ways with incrementally as we go. But obviously there's some tax considerations that if you make a big capital gains, you potentially don't want to sell.
I was going to say, has he been hammered on tax? Like, has he got cash still kicking around in offsets?
There's certainly some cash sitting in offsets, and I think he's made sure one thing, because when you get to the point of you decide to work less, obviously your PAYG is less, so you want to have more liquidity. So there's some of the other considerations that if you start working less and your actual income remains less, you kind of want to have access to money, but you can't access money as easily when your income's less. So going knocking on the door of the bank to say, I want an equity release, is certainly not as easy a conversation when your income starts dropping. So they're the parts of those things that we discuss when we do catch up regularly, is that we actually just dive back into this and say, well, what's the plan from here? Or what are we planning to do for the next 12 months? What's the plans with your work? Where are these properties at? Is it time to maybe consider selling that asset? If we want to increase cash flow again, is it the right time from a tax consideration? Then the accountant comes into the conversation and say, no, let's wait till this financial year, or yes, this financial year you'll work because your income's lower on paper. So having a capital gain event will actually work this year, so on and so forth.
Yeah, you're really in a good accountant if you're doing this sort of stuff, and also a mortgage broker, because he will struggle to get more debt, right? However,
100%.
The debt that he has, as long as he's paying the mortgage repayments, the bank ain't going to ask too many questions.
Not
to your point, you want to, any cash that you got, you want it to be liquid, right? If you don't want to be paying off those loans, because good luck trying to get that money back out, because the banks just won't refinance. Well, likely not to refinance. So you've got to be really strategic about building cash buffers moving forward, and parking that in mortgage is great. It means you're offsetting. So what do you reckon he's actually paying? On what amount do you reckon he's actually paying mortgage repayments on?
As far as the total debt amount?
It's probably after offsets.
It's probably circa 3.5 to 4 million, without going through that detail too much with him there. I think it was circa $3.5-4 million. It was a bit more than that in debt, but then after offsets it was about 3.5-4 million, which worked out to be about circa 300,000, I think, give or take, in interest repayments.
Yep.
And then the income after all said on that was about 175, 185 total gross income, minus your running repairs, maintenance, property management fees, mortgage repayments, left with sort of a circa 130, 135 minus tax, depending on how some of those were held in personal name, some of them in trusts. Then you get to that point of circa sort of that $2,000 a week.
Yeah.
But I guess the other big thing too is that you're holding $10 million in assets. If we're holding this, even if it's partly cash flow positive, even if it's neutral, but William's a very patient person.
Yeah.
If he sits around for another 10 years, where does that $10 million
portfolio?
portfolio
Very different looking portfolio.
Exactly. And
you probably sell one property, pay the debt off, and it's completely unencumbered, right? And this is why, property is a game of patience.
Absolutely.
A lot of people forget that they're in
Strategic
way too much of a rush.
patience.
So strategic patience, and he started early. This is the point. He started early, but it was a bit of a false start.
Yeah. And you see that all the time, especially people who buy their principal place of residence. When they get a job, they get the borrowing capacity, they buy a home, and then they sort of go into life. And life might include kids, it might include a career, all those things. And typically people, it's not until they get like 10, 15 years down the track and they're in their 40s, 50s, and they think, well, hang on, we've got very little debt, and I might be on track to pay off my home very soon. But so what?
That's not going to give you any money every
That's
month.
probably one of the biggest penny drop moments that I see now in my life as a property buyer's agent strategist, is that you get the people early, but you also get the people in their 40s and 50s who have got immense potential, but also probably only just coming to realise that I could have a $5 million home paid off. Nothing changes, unfortunately. Or I could have a $1 million home that's leveraged at $800,000, but I've taken out a bunch of equity, but I've also got a $5 million property portfolio that might be neutrally geared. I'm on the same trajectory. I'm still going to work till I'm retired, but my options at retirement are vastly different if I take one option versus the other. And it's
your
not
principal place of residence isn't going to give you cash flow.
It's not going to give it to you.
And you can sell it and downsize to get a big chunk of cash and put it into the stock market. That's what a lot of people do.
You sound a lot like Robert Kiyosaki these days. Not the stock market
says.
part, but
No.
but it ain't giving you cash flow, I guess, is what
it's not giving you cash flow.
and it's the false economy that I think most people are adhered to when we talk about that mortgage component in your home, is that that's the one of the biggest fallacies that I think sit out there that we've been quite indoctrinated with.
Yeah, it's this great Australian dream to have your own home paid off so no one can take it from you.
Yeah.
But even now they're changing the pension rules, right? They're
Correct.
changing the pension rules right now, where they're saying, because once upon a time when you got to pension, particularly if you needed to go down certain pathways, your principal place of residence was exempt from the asset rules. Now the current government has gone, no, let's not do that anymore.
Yeah.
So it's a liability rather than an asset now.
Correct.
To actually have your owner occupied home loan completely paid off at that point. I'm not giving financial advice, but it's potentially a liability.
Exactly. Well, it's definitely not going to be a benefit.
No.
I think that's becoming very, very obvious.
And it's tell you, like if you need the pension and your means tested on the value of your principal place of residence, you got to sell that in order to. You got to sell it in order to actually get money out of it.
Yep.
So you need to realise some sort of equity event.
Yep.
Now, if you sell it and it's your principal place of residence, well, you're not going to get taxed on it for the moment. Who knows what they're going to do moving forward?
Yeah.
But yeah, risky business.
Absolutely.
Risky business. So what's William going to do? You reckon for 10 years, just chill?
But I think I'm pretty confident that for the next 12 months he'll be chilling and doing a lot of what he planned to do to get. He's worked very hard and done a lot to get in a position that he's in. After that, William's probably listening to this. I think he's probably got a smile on his face, thinking, you know what, I'm happy to challenge you that I won't keep doing what I'm doing for 12 months more. But I'd be curious, put it that way, after 12 months to see what is a life of working very part time and doing all the things you like to do. Because the biggest challenge, he's young. He's mid-40s, right? But
mate, none of his mates are retired yet.
No, and that's the biggest challenge. You knock around with people who are financially independent, and you're like, well, hang on, everyone around me is locked in by a whole bunch of other decisions. You're like, well, what do I do with my time?
No,
Some people do like hanging out by themselves a lot more.
Maybe they do go get a good suntan, whatever floats your boat. But I've seen it happen. People go back in the workforce just so they've got something to do, people to hang out with, right?
Bunnings is full of them.
They do a lot more. They do a lot more long lunches on that basis.
Yeah.
How do you think he would score himself? If you sort of go back in time to when you first caught up with William and you said, this is the strategy, and here we are with our strategy largely delivered. Do you reckon he'd score himself pretty well?
I think he'd score himself if we sort of broke it into what he could have done, the propensity of that 5 years of hiatus when he could have done a lot. And he basically could have done the same thing the previous 5 years.
He could be 5 years ahead.
He probably could be more, because then the compounding effect probably doubles that. He's probably like 10, 15 years of where he could have been if he started early 2011, 12, 13.
Yeah.
But I'd probably score himself a 3 or 4 out of 10 in that rate. But I think from the point of actually... He corralled all of the information he needed, and then once I can say that once he engaged us, within about 3 weeks, we were on the journey to the first purchase, and we executed on, I think, was 8 or 9, maybe even 10 assets over a 4-year period. He remained busy and consistent for that entire time. So I think based on what he did, the asset selection, the location, the balance of across Queensland, Tasmanian, and Sydney properties. The mix was right. The timing was certainly right where we got those assets. The cash flow was right. The growth was right. I think he'd score himself a good 8.5 or 9 out of 10 there. And
how do you think he'd score you guys? You reckon he's 100% happy with everything done, or what would you guys do differently?
It's a risky one for me, because I sat in the position there where you kind of don't know how hard someone wants to go. They say that they want to go hard and they want to get aggressive, but I also have my reservations to push too hard too soon with certain clients, even if they are bullish and they can get the money, because I still want people to understand you go from one or two, a home plus an investment to holding 7 or 8 properties. You know as well as I do, Phil, and when I was talking to William, I personally had a large portfolio. Take the growth and the assets aside.
Hassle.
It is a hassle, and you don't want to burden people you don't want to undersell what it means to be a large-scale property investor, because it is a responsibility. There are things that come outside of the growth and all of the nice things that you have to deal with. So I think he'd be very happy. He probably would have asked me to push harder if he had his time again, because I think he's realised that he's actually he's a very good landlord. He's quite a pragmatic, quite a calm person. So he deals with those stressful times in such a really good way. He's got very good manner and tone with people, and he remains very even-keeled. I probably learnt throughout that he could be pushed a bit harder, and he was comfortable being pushed harder. I think he'd probably score us probably an 8 or 9 out of 10. I think a 10 out of 10 for the result, to be honest with you, if I'm transparent. But I think I could have pushed him harder in retrospect, and he probably would have liked me to maybe crack the whip a little bit more and not be so, maybe sideline sitting for a couple of moments where we could have done more.
And in the big scheme of things, when you're working with clients and say they come and see you and say, look, I want to go reasonably hard at this, the speed at which he operated, how would that compare to how, you work with other people? It's a lot faster.
A lot faster. Wouldn't say a lot faster than a lot of people, but I guess most people. Faster than most, because most, they don't have the finances in place like he did all the time. And most people, even if they have $1 million in equity and $2 million in borrowing capacity, as an example, let's say hypothetically you earn $250,000 as a household income, you've got $1.5 million property, that's your principal place of residence, and you've got $500,000 debt. So you can go and harvest $500,000 in equity tomorrow, no problems, and you might have another $1 million in borrowing capacity. So you could probably go and buy 3 properties in a heartbeat if you wanted to. Most people say, I want to just start with one because I just want to understand how it goes through, and that's normal. And I'm not uncomfortable. And if someone sort of had that position, even though they could buy 3, start with 1, and their position was, hey, I want to get to a 3 in a short term eventually, but I just want to say, let's go softly. Most of the time, properties are pretty slow-moving vehicles. So if we're going to buy one asset in the first 6 months, then one in the next 6, and then one in the 6 after, that's still pretty aggressive. If someone said, look, I can buy all 3 in the first 3 months, I'd say, look, probably careful what you wish for there because there's a lot of paperwork. And the downside versus the upside, it probably doesn't warrant it. I'm probably more comfortable for most to just start with the first. And then after the first is settled in, we typically catch up 6 weeks after for most people in that type of position to say, okay, we bought one, you know what you're in for now. Are you comfortable pushing harder for the next 2 if that were the example? And they might say, no, look, let's just go to that original plan, first purchase, let's recycle 6 months, 12 months afterwards. We typically are going to be, I guess, we're going to be warranted by their cadence and what they're after and their comfort zones as well.
And how many clients sort of go, I want to go hard, and you go, oh, let's just get the first one. And they go, no, I never want to do that again. That was horrible, stressful, horrible.
If I'm completely honest, I would say probably 1 in 30, 1 in 40, I reckon would probably be.
They just go, don't want to do that again.
And it's through nothing more than just the experience of going from signing a contract to seeing a building and pest report. We'll dissect the building and pest report for them, but
Which always look bad.
They always look bad, but I mean, irrespective, that it's daunting because it's a 60-page document. We are, typically some people want to go through the 60-page document word for word. They'll also want to review the mortgage document, which sometimes can be a 50-page document word for word. Then they might want to go through and canvass 10 property managers where we might have already pre-selected 1 or 2. Then they might want to pre-select every single application, and then they might want to look at the quantity surveyor's report and say, look, you missed this, gain that. And then these are the people who you realise after going through it all, irrespective of the property itself, the experience is just too overwhelming for them. And that's fine. I think as long as the purchase isn't going to be a completely and utterly bad financial decision for them, the rest they'll learn along the way. And you definitely get that. People just realise they're not cut out for it.
Yeah, it's fair enough. And looking at William's portfolio, do you think he's a bit light on commercial? Would have you sort of consider he's chasing yield?
That's a really interesting question, Phil, because if you asked him that question 3 years ago, he would have said 100% he is. Yeah. But the irony is he actually sold one of his commercials recently in there. And this is testament to the fact that people were buying commercial, and I'm not going to speak about my clients, but I'd speak to commercial property became very in vogue about 3 or 4 years ago for a period of time where interest rates for commercial debt went from circa 5, 6, 7% to 2 or 3%, pretty much within a year. It dropped, but yields, net yields, and 5-year leases, and I own commercial property, you own commercial property, Phil, you would have seen this in your own portfolio. They basically yields stayed where they were, so i.e. 6% net return on a 3 plus 3, let's say $1 million asset. That looks like somewhere around about $60,000 a year. If you had the whole thing debted at 3%, that's $30,000 a year. You're making a $30,000 arbitrage. What happened in the last 18 months is that $30,000 net profit went immediately. If you weren't fixed, and most people are sort of rolling off those fixed periods now into variable, they're rolling into 6, 7. If you're holding an SMSF, it would be in the 8% for those commercial debts. All of a sudden, that net return may have increased 3%, 5%, 7% per annum over the last 2 or 3 years. I can almost unequivocally say that if you bought 3 years ago and you were cash flow positive, you're probably neutral now. So what happens when commercial debt's neutral? Commercial investments typically don't appreciate anywhere near the same way in value because most investors are buying them on a yield perspective. So if you asked him the question 3 years ago, absolutely. If you asked him the question now, he's thankful that he didn't load up too heavy because ultimately residential becomes that essential need that most people need, which is shelter.
Yeah, whether or not commercial assets appreciate in value at the same or different speed to residential is for debate. We can leave that for another time. But again, it's got to work for him, right?
Completely.
And this is what it's all about. So, to the point, he's happy with his outcome. You can sit around and go, oh, should have done that. What if this? What if that? It's hypothetical. So he's got the portfolio he wants. How long is it taking him now, or how much time, energy, and effort is he putting into managing it?
Quarterly, he's typically putting in about a day every quarter, deep dive, and then he's answering emails, bits and pieces.
So is he sort of super focused on the numbers, or he just gets the stuff coming in?
He gets it. He gets his statements, and he knows it automates. Like any good property investor, everything's automated, direct debited. Catch up with your accountant regularly, and when I say regularly, now it's probably more just annually because he's not buying, he's not selling, he's just holding. It's pretty low hands on.
So his tax return's more about probably tax effectiveness.
Yep. That's the conversation. It's like the old school conversation of if you've got a job and you pay tax, you go back and say, oh well, you claim your sunglasses, claim your
well, they stopped a lot of that a little while ago in the budget.
They did
where you could actually fly to the Gold Coast to visit your property.
That's certainly not there anymore.
No, it's not. And it's all gone. And did he do well in terms of all the depreciation stuff and everything? Like he's ticked all the boxes, pretty squeaky clean.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, maximised where possible, but most of these assets that we bought for him were bought after the changes to essentially the tax rule back in 2017 from a depreciation and quantity surveying perspective. So you couldn't claim all the things that you could on plant and equipment and capital works that he could when he bought anyway, because none of these properties are brand new. So there was some that were claiming some plant and equipment, etc. The commercial properties a bit more, but it certainly wasn't the provision as to why he bought these properties. It certainly wasn't to minimise tax and maximise the overall net figure. They were bonuses as opposed to the real reason why most of these properties or all of these properties were bought.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks for sharing William's story.
No, all good, mate. There's a couple of crackers to come.
This year. But what else you got for us? What's in the wings?
Mate, it's got
to be a long podcast. I apologise, everyone, but
I've got I think there's a couple of interesting ones around self-managed super that I'm not going to go through too much detail there, but a couple of clients that we've worked on who have bought and actually sold self-managed super residential properties and then recycling that profit into other properties. Really interesting.
In super.
Still in super.
Because once it's in there, you can't get it out.
Well, it was always in there, right? Yeah. So it wasn't sort of magically appeared in there. But also, there's a couple other investors who are much earlier stages and younger. So we've got one in particular who's sub 25, bought their first property a couple of years ago, went overseas, took a working first employment overseas, bought their first property before they left, come back, and now they're looking to go to property number 2. And a really, really good example as to what you can do really young on
probably
a really low budget.
Buyer.
Well, time will tell. Tick tock.
We'll get stuck in, and it's good to show and tell the stories from right across the spectrum, from 20-year-olds all the way to 60-year-olds. 70-year-olds are still actively buying property, mainly cash buyers at that point. Banks don't like giving debt to 70-year-olds.
Not so much.
At a point in time, the bank sort of goes, no. But it was good. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for coming in.
No, welcome,
done
mate.
well. It's interesting. And thanks, William, if you're tuning into this. And no doubt you are. Thanks for being so accessible and open and frank with your journey investing in property. This is the sort of stuff that we like here on the Pure Property Podcast with Paul Glossop. And book, where's it at?
It's on its way. We talked about this last
Yes,
podcast, mate. We're close. You can still get the current copy, and I think anyone who is urging or wanting to get a free copy of Surface Guide to Property Investment, writing the next wave, which will be the next book, getting the first one will give you a much deeper understanding.
So you've
as
got to
to
do
where
your
we
homework
started.
first.
Do your homework first, but you can grab a free copy. Is probably the good thing.
Free copy rather than from a bookshop.
Yeah, well, you can get a free copy. You just handle postage. I think it's about maybe $9 or $10 for postage. Jump on purepropertyinvestment.com, and I think if you go to
do you drop
free
ship
book,
that, or does someone sit there put in a little thing with a note from you?
I literally have my office does it for you. It's hand signed and it's delivered.
Oh, actually got a little signature.
Yeah, mate, we do it personally.
How many books you sign a week?
Sign? I couldn't tell you. But books we've sold, it's over 8,500 now.
God.
Yeah.
Who would have thought people want to know what you're doing? Anyway, there must be someone in there. If they're giving you a second run, anyway, I look forward to seeing that's Paul Glossop from Pure Property Investment. Thanks for coming in, mate. Thanks for tuning, everyone. Longer one, but this is how we're going to go about doing this, pulling these stories apart. So if you want to Paul's clients and you actually want to be part of this, I'm sure you'd be happy to be able to do it. What's the best way to get? If people just want to chat to you guys, or they want to go down this pathway of getting a bit of a strategy and work out whether they want to use you, what do they do?
Purepropertyinvestment.com. They can just hit the Inquire Now button and that'll take them directly to my calendar. If you're a previous client of mine, you know my email address and you can just fire me an email or give me a call. A lot of people would have my number or the office number, 1300 985428.
There you go, and send feedback directly to Paul about how we can do this better.
No, 5-star reviews.
Generally, if
no, absolutely.
If you've got any sort of feedback or constructive criticism, or you've got some ideas of how we can use this time together to deliver greater value to you. We are absolutely all ears, but please keep those reviews coming. So good to see. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll see you again next time. Until then, bye-bye.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property, or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.